"You never belonged here," my daughter-in-law whispered, her voice so soft no one else at the table could hear it, and I smiled as if she had just complimented the meal. The dining room was warm, filled with the gentle clink of silverware against china and the low hum of polite conversation, the kind of evening I had spent decades creating for my family. Yet in that single moment, everything felt hollow, like a stage set after the audience has gone home. I adjusted my napkin on my lap, keeping my movements steady, controlled, as if nothing had shifted beneath my feet, but inside, something quiet and final settled into place. Across from me, my son Daniel laughed at something his sister Rachel said, his attention never once drifting toward me, and I realized then that the distance I had been feeling for months was not imagined, it was deliberate. Emily leaned back in her chair, her expression composed, almost serene, as if she had just confirmed something she had believed for a long time, and I wondered how many conversations had happened without me, how many decisions had already been made about my place in this house. The chandelier above us cast a soft golden light over the table, illuminating the same polished surface I had once saved for years to afford, the same table where birthdays were celebrated and holidays were shared, and yet now it felt like I was sitting in a stranger's home. I reached for my glass of water, noticing how steady my hand remained, and that steadiness surprised me more than anything else, because I had always thought that if this moment ever came, if I were ever pushed this far, I would break, but I didn't. Instead, I observed. I listened. I let the silence stretch just long enough to feel its weight. And then, without raising my voice or changing my expression, I placed a small brass key on the table beside my plate. It made a soft, almost insignificant sound as it touched the wood, but it was enough. Emily's eyes flickered toward it for a fraction of a second before she looked away, and that was all I needed to see. No one else noticed. Not Daniel, not Rachel, not the others who continued eating and talking as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Because that key was not just a key. It was a reminder of something they had all forgotten, something I had allowed them to forget. I folded my hands neatly in front of me, my smile still in place, my posture calm and composed, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt completely certain of what I needed to do next. I did not sleep much that night, not because of what had been said at the table, but because of what I had started to understand, the kind of understanding that does not come all at once, but settles in slowly, like dust revealing the shape of something that has always been there. The next morning, I arrived at Thomas Green's office 10 minutes early, the same way my husband always had, punctual to the minute, believing that respect was shown in the smallest habits. The building had not changed, polished floors, quiet hallways, the faint scent of old paper and coffee, and for a moment, it felt as if I had stepped back into a version of my life where things were still certain. Thomas greeted me with a firm handshake, his expression kind but careful, as if he had already decided that whatever he was about to say required precision. We sat across from each other at a long wooden desk, and he did not rush, he never had. Instead, he opened a folder slowly, deliberately, and placed a set of documents in front of me. He explained that shortly before my husband passed, there had been an addition to his will, a clause that had not been activated or even discussed because it depended entirely on future behavior, something my husband had hoped would never become relevant. I listened without interrupting, my hands resting quietly in my lap, but I felt the weight of each word as it settled into place. The clause, as Thomas described it, was simple in its language but absolute in its consequence. Any direct family member who attempted to remove me from my home, or who demonstrated deliberate exclusion or disrespect toward me in a verifiable way, would forfeit their claim to a significant portion of the estate. I remember blinking once, just once, as if my mind needed that brief pause to adjust, because in all the years I had known my husband, I had never seen him act out of suspicion, only out of quiet protection. Thomas slid the final page toward me, where my husband's signature sat firm and unmistakable, dated just 3 weeks before his passing. And in that moment, everything shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, with a clarity that felt almost calm. I realized then that what I had experienced at the dinner table was not the beginning of something. It was the confirmation of something already in motion, and for the first time, I understood that I was not the one being pushed out. I was the one holding the door. When I stepped out of Thomas Green's office, the late afternoon sun felt different against my skin, not warmer, not brighter, just clearer, as if something that had been clouding my view for years had finally been lifted without ceremony. I drove home slowly, taking the long route through streets I had not passed in years, past the small bakery where my husband used to stop every Sunday morning, past the park where Daniel learned to ride his bicycle. Each familiar place carrying a memory that now felt carefully rearranged in my mind. It was not that those moments had been false, they were real, but they no longer stood alone. They connected to something deeper, something I had refused to see. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it always had, perfectly kept, welcoming, a place that suggested stability and belonging. And yet I could no longer ignore how easily that image could be used as a cover. Inside, I found Emily in the kitchen, organizing cabinets that had not needed organizing, her movements precise, purposeful, as if she was preparing for something that had already been decided. She greeted me with a polite smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes, and asked about my day in a tone that sounded practiced rather than curious. I answered just as calmly, offering nothing more than necessary, and watched as she nodded, satisfied with the surface of the conversation. Later, I passed Rachel in the hallway, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low but not low enough, and I caught only a fragment, something about timing, about making sure everything was in place, and when she noticed me, she paused for just a second before turning away, continuing her conversation in a softer tone. It was a small moment, one that could easily be dismissed, but now, I did not dismiss anything. That evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I let my thoughts move freely through the past, not searching for comfort, but for clarity. I remembered the first time Emily had gently suggested that the house might be too large for me, the way Daniel had avoided the conversation by changing the subject, the quiet adjustments that followed, a drawer cleared without asking, a document moved from one place to another, each action small enough to overlook, but together, forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. I sat there in the dim light, my hands resting still, my breathing even, and for the first time, I allowed myself to see the full picture, not as a series of misunderstandings, but as a deliberate arrangement, carefully built over time, and I understood then that what they believed to be my weakness had been nothing more than my patience, and patience, I realized, could be far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The next morning began like any other, or at least that was how I allowed it to appear. I woke before anyone else, made coffee, and stood by the kitchen window watching the quiet street as the first light settled across the lawns. Everything calm, everything ordinary, and yet beneath that calm, my thoughts moved with precision. I no longer questioned what I had seen or heard. I no longer tried to soften it with explanations that made it easier to accept. Instead, I began to notice details with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar. After breakfast, when the house emptied and the sound of the front door closing signaled that I was alone, I walked slowly down the hallway, not with hesitation, but with purpose, stopping briefly outside the study where Daniel had started keeping most of his paperwork, a room that had once belonged to my husband, a room I had rarely entered since his passing out of respect for memories I had not wanted to disturb. I pushed. The door opened quietly and stepped inside, the air carrying the faint scent of paper and polished wood, unchanged, yet subtly different in its arrangement. Files were stacked neatly on the desk, labeled in Daniel's handwriting, organized in a way that suggested efficiency, but also control. I did not search through everything. I did not need to. I had learned that the truth often revealed itself in smaller ways, in what was left slightly out of place rather than what was hidden entirely. A folder near the edge of the desk caught my attention, not because it was concealed, but because it was positioned as if it had been handled recently and returned without care. I opened it slowly, scanning the contents with steady eyes, property evaluations, transfer estimates, notes regarding market timing, all written in neutral language, professional, detached, and yet unmistakable in their intent. There was no direct mention of me, no statement that declared their plan outright, but the absence of my name in documents that concerned my own home spoke louder than any accusation. I closed the folder carefully and returned it to its exact position, leaving no trace that I had been there, my movements deliberate, practiced, as if I had been preparing for this moment without realizing it. As I stepped back into the hallway, I paused for a second, listening to the silence of the house. And in that silence, I understood something with absolute certainty. They believed the process was already underway. They believed the outcome was inevitable. And that belief was their first mistake. I walked back to the kitchen, poured another cup of coffee, and sat down at the table where I had once spent years serving others. And for the first time, I allowed myself to plan, not with anger, not with urgency, but with a calm that came from knowing that everything they had built depended on one thing: they had completely overlooked me. From that moment on, I became careful in ways I had never needed to be before, not cautious out of fear, but deliberate in every word, every gesture, every silence I allowed to linger just a second longer than expected. When Daniel returned home that evening, I greeted him the same way I always had, with a soft smile and a simple question about his day. And he answered just as predictably, brief, distracted, already halfway somewhere else in his mind. But now I noticed how quickly he moved past me, how naturally he assumed I would remain where I was, unchanged, unquestioning. Emily followed behind him, placing her purse on the counter with a quiet precision, her eyes flickering toward me just long enough to acknowledge my presence before turning away, and I wondered if she believed her words from the night before had settled something. If she thought they had pushed me into a corner, I would not leave. Dinner was quieter that night, the conversation thinner, stretched over pauses that felt more intentional than before, and I allowed myself to remain part of it without ever truly engaging, answering when spoken to, observing when I was not. At one point, Rachel mentioned, almost casually, that the real estate market in the area had been improving, her tone light, her words carefully neutral, but I saw the way Emily glanced at her. A quick exchange of understanding that lasted less than a second, and then both of them looked away as if nothing had passed between them at all. I kept my expression unchanged, my posture relaxed. But inside, each small moment confirmed what I already knew. They were moving forward, confident, coordinated, certain that I would not interfere. Later that evening, after the house had settled into its usual quiet, I sat alone in the study, the same room I had entered earlier that day, and I placed the brass key gently on the desk in front of me, turning it once between my fingers, feeling its weight, its familiarity. I did not rush. I did not act impulsively. Instead, I reached for the phone and dialed a number I had not used in years, one I remembered without needing to search for it. And when Thomas Green answered, I spoke clearly, calmly, asking him to prepare the documents we had discussed, to ensure that everything was not only understood, but enforceable, visible, undeniable. When I ended the call, I sat for a moment longer, listening to the quiet of the house, the same quiet that had once comforted me, and I realized that nothing here had truly changed, not the walls, not the rooms, not the people moving through them. The only thing that had changed was that I was no longer waiting to be included in something that had already decided to exclude me. I was preparing to decide what happened next. 2 days later, I suggested we have a family dinner. Nothing elaborate, just something simple to bring everyone together. And the way the room shifted when I said it told me more than any words could have. A brief pause, a glance between Emily and Rachel, a hesitation so subtle it would have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching for it. Daniel agreed quickly, almost too quickly, as if he believed this was something he should encourage, something harmless, and Emily followed with a polite smile, her voice light as she asked what she could bring, playing her role perfectly, just as she always had. I told her not to worry, that I would take care of everything. And for a moment, I saw something flicker in her expression, something uncertain, something that disappeared just as quickly as it appeared. The rest of the day passed in a quiet rhythm, preparations made with the same care I had given to every gathering over the years, the table set with the same dishes, the same arrangement, every detail exactly as they expected it to be, because expectation was a powerful thing. It kept people comfortable. It made them predictable. When the evening arrived, everyone took their places as they always had. Daniel at the head of the table, Emily beside him, Rachel across from me. Their positions unchanged, their roles firmly in place, and I watched as they settled into the familiarity of it, their shoulders relaxing, their voices easing into casual conversation, as if nothing had ever been at risk. I served the meal calmly, moving between them with quiet precision, listening more than speaking, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally, because it was not what I said that mattered, it was what they would say when they believed I was no longer paying attention. It did not take long. Rachel was the first to begin, her tone casual, almost thoughtful, as she mentioned how difficult it must be for someone to maintain a house of this size alone, how it might be wiser to consider other options, something smaller, more manageable, and Emily nodded, adding gently that change could be a good thing, that sometimes letting go was the best way to move forward. Daniel said nothing at first, his silence hanging in the air, and then, almost reluctantly, he agreed, his voice quiet, careful, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. I kept my gaze on my plate, my expression unchanged, letting their words settle into the space between us, each sentence confirming exactly what they believed to be true, that I would listen, that I would accept, that I would step aside without resistance. When the conversation paused, I placed my fork down slowly, the soft sound drawing their attention, and for the first time that evening, I looked directly at each of them, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that made them shift slightly in their seats, because in that moment, without raising my voice or changing my tone, I understood something they did not, that this dinner was not a discussion, it was a reveal, and they had just said everything I needed them to say. No one spoke for a moment after I set my fork down, the silence stretching just long enough to make them uncomfortable, just long enough for them to feel that something had shifted without yet understanding what it was. Emily was the first to recover, offering a small smile as she reached for her glass, her movements controlled but slightly too deliberate, as if she were adjusting to a change in the atmosphere she had not expected. Rachel leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms loosely, her expression composed but watchful, and Daniel glanced between us, sensing something he could not quite name, his brow tightening for just a second before he looked away. I let the silence settle completely before I spoke, my voice calm, even. The same tone I had used for years, the same tone they had learned to associate with agreement, with quiet acceptance. I told them I appreciated their concern, that I understood what they were saying, and I saw the immediate shift in their posture, the subtle relaxation, the way tension left their shoulders as they assumed the outcome had already been decided. Emily nodded, her smile softening. Rachel exhaled slowly, as if confirming something she had expected all along, and Daniel gave a small, almost relieved nod, as though a difficult conversation had resolved itself without conflict. I continued, keeping my voice steady, explaining that perhaps they were right, that perhaps it was time to consider changes, and as I spoke, I watched their reactions carefully, the quick glance Emily shared with Rachel, the almost imperceptible lift at the corner of Rachel's mouth, the quiet satisfaction that settled over the table. They believed they had guided me to this point, that their plan had unfolded exactly as intended, and I allowed them to believe it, because belief, I had learned, could be more powerful than any argument. When I finished speaking, I reached beside my plate and picked up the brass key, holding it lightly between my fingers, turning it once before placing it back down on the table in clear view of everyone. This time, they noticed. Emily's eyes dropped to it first, her expression tightening just slightly before she forced her smile back into place, and Daniel followed her gaze, his confusion evident as he leaned forward a fraction, as if trying to place something he had forgotten. Rachel said nothing, but her attention fixed on the key with a focus that had not been there before, her earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious. I did not explain it. I did not need to. Instead, I simply stood up, gathering my plate with the same calm precision as always, and walked toward the kitchen, leaving the key where it was, small and unassuming, yet suddenly impossible to ignore, because in that moment, without raising my voice or revealing anything directly, I had introduced a single question into their certainty, and I knew from experience that once doubt entered a plan, it did not leave quietly. The sound of running water in the kitchen covered the quiet tension that remained in the dining room, but I did not rush. I let each movement take its time, placing dishes into the sink one by one, as if nothing outside of this small routine required my attention. Behind me, I could hear the faint murmur of voices, lowered, cautious now, no longer as confident as they had been just minutes before. I did not need to hear every word to understand the shift. Doubt had entered, and with it came hesitation. After a moment, I turned off the faucet, dried my hands slowly, and returned to the doorway, without stepping fully back into the room, allowing them just enough awareness of my presence to alter their behavior again. Daniel was holding the key now, turning it between his fingers, his brow furrowed in quiet confusion, while Emily watched him carefully, her expression composed but no longer relaxed. Rachel sat still, her posture straighter than before, her gaze fixed on the table as if she were reconsidering something she had already decided was settled. I walked back in calmly and took my seat without asking for the key, without acknowledging it at all, and that absence of reaction seemed to unsettle them more than any explanation would have. Daniel cleared his throat, asking casually what the key was for, his tone light, but edged with uncertainty, and I met his eyes with the same steady calm I had carried all evening. I told him it was something his father had left for me, something important, and I let the sentence end there, unfinished, allowing the weight of it to settle without clarification. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, the small movement almost invisible, but I saw it, and Rachel shifted in her chair, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet alertness that had not been there before. No one pressed further, not immediately, because uncertainty makes people careful, and careful people reveal themselves slowly. I reached for my napkin, folding it neatly beside my plate, and then I looked at each of them in turn, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a calm attention that made them hold their breath just a little longer than usual. In that moment, nothing had been revealed, no truth had been spoken outright, and yet everything had begun to change, because they no longer knew what I knew, they no longer understood the position they believed they held, and as I sat there in the quiet that followed, I realized that this was the exact moment their certainty began to collapse, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with a single unanswered question they could not ignore. The room remained quiet longer than it should have, the kind of silence that no one knows how to break without revealing too much, and I let it stretch, because time, in moments like this, has a way of making people uncomfortable enough to speak without thinking. Daniel finally set the key back on the table, his fingers lingering on it for a second as if he expected it to explain itself, and when it did not, he leaned back in his chair, glancing toward Emily, then Rachel, searching for something unspoken between them. Emily was the first to respond, her voice calm, carefully measured, suggesting that perhaps it would be a good idea to talk about things openly, to make sure everyone was on the same page, her words wrapped in concern, but the intent beneath them now visible in a way it had not been before. Rachel nodded slightly, adding that clarity was important, especially when decisions about the future were involved, and as she spoke, her gaze shifted briefly toward the key again, as if it had already become part of whatever calculation she was making. I listened without interrupting, my hands resting lightly on the table, my posture unchanged, and when they finished, I simply reached into my bag and placed a sealed envelope beside the key. The movement was small, deliberate, but it drew their attention immediately, all three of them watching as I adjusted it so that it faced them, the paper crisp, the edges perfectly straight. I did not rush to explain it. I allowed the moment to settle, allowed their curiosity to grow into something sharper, something closer to concern. Daniel looked at me, his voice quieter now, asking what it was, and I met his gaze with the same calm I had carried all evening. I told him it was something his father had prepared, something that had only recently been brought to my attention, and I saw the shift happen again, more pronounced this time, the way his shoulders stiffened slightly, the way Emily's expression tightened despite her effort to remain composed, the way Rachel leaned forward just a fraction, her attention fully engaged now. No one reached for the envelope. No one spoke for several seconds. And in that silence, I understood that the balance had already begun to change, not because I had raised my voice or made any accusation, but because I had introduced something they could not control, something that existed beyond their plans, beyond their assumptions. I folded my hands gently in front of me, waiting not for them to act, but for them to realize that whatever came next was no longer something they could predict. And as I sat there, watching them struggle to decide whether to open the envelope or leave it untouched, I knew that this was the moment everything they had built began to turn against them. Daniel was the one who finally reached for the envelope, his movements slower than usual, as if he understood that whatever was inside would not simply be information, but something that could not be undone once seen. Emily watched his hand closely, her expression carefully neutral, but the tension in her posture betrayed her, while Rachel leaned forward just enough to signal that she was no longer pretending this was a casual conversation. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply watched as Daniel broke the seal and unfolded the document inside, his eyes scanning the page once, then again, more slowly the second time, as if his mind needed time to catch up with what he was reading. The change in his face was subtle at first, a slight tightening around his eyes, a pause in his breathing, and then it deepened, confusion giving way to something heavier, something closer to realization. Emily shifted beside him, her patience thinning as she asked quietly what it said, and when he did not answer immediately, she reached for the paper herself, her fingers quick, almost urgent now. Rachel stood up slightly from her chair, not fully, but enough to see over the table, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the concern she could no longer hide. I remained exactly where I was, my hands folded, my expression calm, because there was no need for me to explain anything. The document was doing that for me, line by line, word by word, in a way that could not be argued or dismissed. Emily's eyes moved rapidly across the page, her lips pressing together as she read, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw uncertainty replace control, her confidence faltering under the weight of something she had not anticipated. Daniel leaned back slowly, his gaze shifting from the paper to me, searching, questioning, as if trying to understand how something so significant had existed without his knowledge. Rachel said nothing, but her silence was no longer composed. It was calculating, as if she were already trying to find a way around what she was seeing, a way to regain the ground she felt slipping beneath her. I let the moment hold, let the realization settle fully into the room, because this was not about confrontation, it was about clarity, the kind that does not need to be forced, the kind that arrives quietly and changes everything. And as I sat there, watching each of them absorb what had just been placed in front of them, I understood that the plan they had built so carefully had not just been interrupted, it had been undone in a way they could not reverse, because for the first time, they were no longer deciding my place in this house. They were realizing they had never truly understood it at all. No one spoke for a long time after the last page fell flat against the table, the quiet no longer uncertain, but heavy with something final, something that could not be undone by explanation or softened by apology. Daniel was still holding the document, but his grip had loosened, as if he no longer knew what to do with it. And when he finally looked at me, there was something in his expression I had not seen in years, not authority, not distance, but something closer to understanding, though it had come far too late. Emily sat perfectly still, her earlier composure replaced by a stillness that felt forced, as if any movement might confirm what she was trying not to accept, while Rachel's gaze had shifted entirely, no longer confident, no longer calculating, but searching, as though she were trying to find a version of this moment where things had gone differently. I let them sit with it, not out of cruelty, but because this was the first honest moment we had shared in a long time, one without pretense, without quiet manipulation hidden behind polite words. After a while, I reached forward and gently took the key back from the table, holding it for a second before placing it into my bag. The motion simple, but complete, as if closing something that had been left open for too long. I stood up slowly, not in anger, not in triumph, but with a calm that came from clarity, and as I looked at each of them, I realized that nothing I could say would change what they had already chosen to become. This house, these walls, the memories they carried, they were never just places or objects. They were built on trust, on quiet understanding, on the belief that family meant something beyond convenience. And once that belief was broken, no document, no clause, no consequence could truly restore it. I adjusted my coat, my movements steady, familiar, and walked toward the door, pausing only once, not to look back, but to let the silence settle one last time. You were right, I said quietly, my voice even, without bitterness, without regret. I never belonged here. I let the words rest between us for just a moment before continuing, softer, but certain, but everything here was never yours to take. Then I stepped outside, closing the door behind me with a quiet finality, the cool air meeting me like something honest, something unguarded. And as I walked away from the place I had once called home, I did not feel loss. I felt something far steadier, something they had mistaken for weakness for far too long. And for the first time in years, I was no longer waiting to be accepted. I was simply moving forward without them.